Content warnings for this episode are for discussions of medical abuse, once again, particularly the medical abuse of ME/CFS patients. So, ME had become psychologized. What then? The group of UK psychiatrists saw that outbreak of an ME-like illness in Incline, Nevada. They saw the CDC's report on it, saw it had been renamed chronic fatigue syndrome, and they took that name and ran with it. They ran like they were holding hands with it, frolicking through a fucking meadow. They loved this renaming, because to them, that is exactly what this illness was. Just lazy bastard, sleepy tired syndrome. They didn't believe it was biological, so why give it a name that suggests it is? Some of these psychiatrists worked on a slew of papers published throughout the 1980s and 1990s, selecting to use the name CFS and not ME to describe this cohort of patients. There were quite a lot of these psychiatrists around, but I want us to remember these three names in particular: Simon Wesley, Peter White, and Michael Sharp. These three were, and seemingly still are, unless they would like to freely declare that they're not, staunch believers that ME is psychosomatic, and they will pop up in this story again. So, what do these papers talk about? By and large, they reinforce the idea that this was a psychiatric or psychosomatic disorder, and they attempted to justify what they deemed to be the treatments for this illness. Get ready to be pissed off again. The two treatments they cooked up for us patients were graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. The former is pretty much what it sounds like, just exercise increasing in intensity over time, and the latter is a type of talking therapy you've probably already heard of that aims to identify and challenge any unhelpful beliefs a patient might be holding on to. Now, in the time it took me to just say that last sentence, you've probably already identified a few reasons as to why these treatments might be massively problematic for ME patients, but we're going to briefly walk through them together anyway. Graded exercise therapy first. Exercise is in the name. We know that this makes patients worse. I don't think there's much else to say. This will harm patients. And for a lot of patients, this did make them worse. A lot worse. For some, it even resulted in a permanent degradation of their health. And with cognitive behavioral therapy, on the surface, that sounds like it could be helpful. It's not unheard of to offer therapy to people with chronic illnesses to help them cope with the impact it has on their lives. Cancer patients, for example, are quite routinely offered cognitive behavioral therapy. But remember what the psychiatrists pushing these treatments believed. Remember how they saw ME. They thought that it was, at its core, caused by problematic beliefs that led to unhelpful behaviors. So this is what the therapy focused on, the supposedly false belief that a patient held by believing in their own illness, which is absurd and so heartbreaking and infuriating to think about. Of course we patients believe we're ill, because we are ill. This is essentially like sitting a cancer patient down and telling them that they should just stop believing that they have cancer and then they'll get better. That's just not how this illness works at all. If anything, if you're told this illness is all in your head, then that will encourage you to ignore the symptoms you experience and just push through the exhaustion. It could lead to a situation like what happened to Jennifer Bria. It could even convince you to try graded exercise therapy, and that, unsurprisingly, is going to make you feel a lot worse. This is pretty ironic considering they were championed by psychiatrists, but both of these treatments will likely have an extremely negative impact on a patient's mental health, not even just their physical health. The message that these treatments send out to patients is horrible and resoundingly clear, like some kind of fucked up gong. They seem to say, your illness is due to your thoughts, your lack of exercise and effort, things well within your control. Therefore, your illness is your fault, and if you don't get better, it's because you either aren't trying hard enough or it's because you're choosing to stay sick. That's a brutal message for anyone to hear, but especially so when everything in your life, your work, education, family life, your body has been torn apart by an illness you don't understand. Even to just attempt these treatments, you'll have to work against what your body is telling you, which is confusing and distressing. And when you inevitably don't get better by doing them, when they actually make you feel worse, you become even more confused and distressed. You'll probably end up seriously doubting yourself, asking, is it me? Am I not trying hard enough? I was told that this would make me better, and I want to get better, so why can't I? What am I doing wrong? I want to remind us all again, ME isn't a rare illness. There were an estimated 250,000 ME patients in the UK at the time I was diagnosed, 250,000 of us in a country with a population of about 70 million. That makes it more common than HIV and MS combined. It's also not a mild illness. It has a greater average negative impact on health-related quality of life than even some types of cancer or heart disease. So that means that there were, and still are, a lot of already very ill people being devastatingly hurt by this relentless medical gaslighting, not just in the UK. By publishing paper after paper pushing graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, regardless of how questionable the contents were, regardless of what patients themselves were saying, certain psychiatrists gave these treatments an air of credibility. Why would so many papers be published in reputable scientific journals by reputable psychiatrists, after all, if they weren't onto something? So, unfortunately, these treatments were picked up globally, not just in the UK. Reaction from the media was, like I mentioned in the last episode, depressing. In the US, the nickname yuppie flu spread, along with the idea that these patients were just burnt out young professionals and hysterical malingerers, not people affected with a real, chronic, biological illness. Sympathy was hard to come by, and understanding was rare. Many patients spent years of their lives going back to see medical professionals again and again, desperate to find answers as to why they were feeling so unwell, why they weren't getting any better. Uncomfortably sat in chairs in doctors' offices, sweating, out of breath, in pain, more exhausted than words can describe, scrambling for thoughts in heads that feel like they're filled with cotton wool, these patients were infinitely more likely to be met with a raised eyebrow rather than a look of concern. That's exactly what happened to me. I was sent to see a specialist just a few years ago at the Chronic Fatigue Clinic, terrible name, in the city where I live, and if you can believe it, the person I saw there was a cognitive behavioral therapist, not a real doctor. I did eventually get a diagnosis, but I had to practically beg for it. It was humiliating. The cognitive behavioral therapist who diagnosed me was very much of the mind that this was all in my head. She had me fill out a kind of symptom diary where I would track my fatigue and sleep for every hour of the day, and this lasted about 2 weeks. When I got back to her at the clinic, which only offered in-person appointments, by the way, I handed her a sheet of paper filled with squares shaded in black for sleep and red for severe fatigue. I was sleeping for about 15 hours every day at that time, and the majority of my waking hours I spent in a severe state of debilitating fatigue and pain, where I had to just lie down in bed and I couldn't do anything else. I was expecting this evidence I was providing to be convincing. I thought it would really hammer home just how badly ill I was. I was still a teenager at the time, but she took the sheet of paper from me, looked over it, and looked back at me, and she honestly looked disgusted. She looked at me like I was insane. The way she treated me the entire time I was there was just completely bereft of even a shred of empathy. She told me that people are like lithium phone batteries, and that if we sleep too much, we end up getting a sleep hangover, whatever that means, and that makes us worse. She insinuated that I was wasting my life by sleeping so much. She made me admit that. She said, if you're sleeping for 15 hours every day, how much time to be awake does that leave you with? And then she paused and waited for me to say 9. And then she looked at me with this condescending smirk that will haunt me forever, and she said, well, That's not much time to be awake to give yourself every day, is it? Like I didn't already know I was losing out on so much of my time. That's why I was there to see her, and she insulted me instead of helping me. I left every appointment I ever had with her, and I waited until I got somewhere quiet and private, and I would just burst into tears. I was 19 years old. I could see very well that I was losing out on my youth and my time, and I didn't understand why. And I was so sick, and I was so confused and scared, and I was made to feel like it was my fault. Getting referred to this chronic fatigue clinic was the only treatment I have ever received for this disease. I got my diagnosis, I was signed off from the clinic, and ever since then, I've just been left without any help or advice from a doctor whatsoever to navigate managing a life with ME. The only actually helpful advice I've received is from the ME Association, and I had to find that myself. No one even told me that the ME Association existed. I spent the first few years of my time with this illness without even having heard that name. But as genuinely traumatizing as my experience at that clinic was, I know that I am so incredibly privileged to have received a diagnosis at all. And remember, this is just my story, the story of a patient who was just about well enough to even attend some of these appointments in the first place. It was all just a few years ago. Patients all over the world have been treated this way and much worse for about half a century now. I've been racking my brains for years now to try and understand how on earth something like that could happen to me, how so many decades could go by in which we ME patients have been treated with such contempt. And in reality, there is no one reason. It's more a complex web of unfortunate circumstances and mistakes and fiascos that led us to this point. But I'm trying to untangle that web with you here and now. I have come up with one theory for myself that I'll share with you in the next episode.